I remember the exact sound of the microphone screeching before he said my name. It cut through the ballroom like a warning siren, sharp and metallic, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers and the polished marble floors. 200 employees turned their heads toward the stage. I was standing near the back, balancing a glass of sparkling water in one hand, rehearsing the quarterly performance numbers in my mind in case anyone asked. I had no idea I was about to become the entertainment. Before we move forward, Daniel said, adjusting his cufflinks with exaggerated calm, I'd like to address a performance issue that perfectly represents what's been holding this division back. There was a murmur. A few people shifted uncomfortably. He smiled, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. Clara Bennett, would you mind standing up? For a split second, I genuinely thought there must be another Clara in the room. But then the spotlight operator, eager and obedient, swept the beam across the crowd until it landed directly on my face. The brightness was blinding. Conversations died instantly. I stood, slowly, not because I was ashamed, but because I needed those 2 seconds to steady my heartbeat. Daniel had been our new regional manager for exactly 3 weeks. Young, polished, imported from headquarters with a resume full of buzzwords and a reputation for transformational leadership. In 21 days, he had replaced half the team leads, cancelled 2 long-standing vendor contracts, and scheduled this lavish accountability summit at a 5-star hotel. I had worked for the company for 9 years. 9. I knew the rhythms of our clients, the seasonal dips, the silent warning signs in quarterly forecasts. I knew which vendors overpromised and which ones quietly saved us during crises. I had built the analytics framework that the executive team relied on every Monday morning. But Daniel didn't ask about any of that. Instead, he clicked a button on the remote in his hand. The massive screen behind him flickered to life, displaying a slide titled, When Comfort Becomes Complacency. My name was underneath it. A ripple of shock moved through the room like a physical wave. As you can see, Daniel continued smoothly, pacing across the stage. Clara's department missed its aggressive growth target by 4% last quarter. 4%. Aggressive growth target. The kind he had increased 2 weeks after arriving. He didn't mention that the original target had been surpassed. He didn't mention that supply chain delays, documented and forecasted months earlier, had affected 3 of our largest accounts. He didn't mention that I had personally secured a retention agreement with our biggest client, preventing a loss that would have cost the company millions. He just let the number hang there. 4%. In this company, he went on, we don't reward mediocrity. We confront it. A few nervous laughs echoed from somewhere near the front. Most people stared at the floor. Some stared at me. I kept my expression neutral. Inside, though, something was shifting, not breaking, not shrinking. Just recalibrating. Daniel stopped pacing and looked directly at me. Clara, would you care to explain to everyone why your team failed to meet expectations? Failed. The word tasted bitter, even in silence. 200 pairs of eyes. I could feel the weight of them. Some sympathetic, some curious, a few calculating. This was not about performance. This was a display, a public lesson. He wanted to establish dominance. To signal that tenure meant nothing. That loyalty was expendable. That fear was an effective management strategy. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that I had spent the last 6 months preparing for a moment exactly like this. Not because I expected humiliation, but because I had anticipated instability. When rumors first started circulating about a leadership overhaul, I did something most people didn't. I paid attention to the financial inconsistencies buried in our internal reports. Small discrepancies at first. Vendor invoices approved unusually fast. Consulting contracts signed without competitive bidding. Marketing expenditures routed through third-party firms with vague deliverables. I hadn't jumped to conclusions. I had documented, carefully, methodically, dates, approvals, digital signatures, including Daniel's. He had been consulting for our division before becoming manager. An external strategist. That's what they called him. I remembered the day his name first appeared in our expense breakdowns. The numbers didn't align, not fully, but that wasn't tonight's story. Tonight, he thought this was simple. Embarrass the veteran employee. Signal authority. Move on. I raised the microphone that one of the event assistants had hurriedly handed me. My hand wasn't shaking. Thank you, Daniel, I said evenly. My voice carried farther than I expected, calm and measured. You're absolutely right that we missed the revised growth target by 4%. There was a faint shift in the audience. They had expected defensiveness, excuses, maybe tears. I'd love to provide context, I continued. Should I use the full dataset, or just the portion displayed on the slide? A flicker crossed his face. It was subtle, but I saw it. He hadn't expected engagement. He certainly hadn't expected confidence. The slide is sufficient, he replied curtly. I nodded. The slide reflects projections adjusted on May 14th, correct? He hesitated. Yes. And the supply chain disruption affecting our top 3 accounts was formally reported on May 3rd? A longer pause. I believe so. And the retention agreement signed on June 2nd prevented a projected loss of $2.3 million, correct? Now the room was silent in a different way. Not uncomfortable. Alert. Daniel shifted his weight. That's not the point. It's precisely the point, I said gently. Contrast framing. That's what my old mentor used to call it. When someone isolates a statistic to control a narrative, you widen the frame. You don't argue the number. You redefine the story around it. Our team didn't fail, I said, still looking at him, not the audience. We absorbed a projected 7-figure loss, stabilized 3 accounts during a logistics crisis, and maintained 96% of our forecasted revenue under revised targets implemented mid-quarter. Someone in the second row started typing on their phone. Daniel forced a thin smile. Clara, this isn't a debate. No, I agreed softly. It's a conversation about performance. And that's when I realized something important. He had assumed I was alone up there. But I wasn't. Not really. Because buried in my briefcase, in a slim black folder I had brought to the summit just in case, was documentation linking his consulting firm to inflated invoices approved during the transition period. Invoices that bypassed standard review. Invoices that tied directly to the aggressive growth targets he had just used to humiliate me. He thought he was exposing weakness. He didn't realize he was standing on glass. I lowered the microphone slightly and met his gaze. Calm, steady. Would you like me to continue? I asked. For the first time since he stepped onto that stage, Daniel looked uncertain. And the spotlight didn't feel quite as blinding anymore. For a moment, Daniel didn't answer. He glanced toward the front row where the executive vice president, Martin Hale, sat with his fingers steepled under his chin. Martin wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning either. He was watching me, Daniel, the room. Calculating. Daniel cleared his throat. We can discuss operational details later, he said finally. Right now, this is about accountability. Accountability. The word landed differently this time. Of course, I replied, lowering the microphone. I agree. I handed it back to the event assistant and sat down. The spotlight moved away from me, but the energy in the ballroom had shifted permanently. Daniel continued through his presentation, slides about efficiency, restructuring, aggressive scaling, but something in his cadence faltered. He was no longer commanding the room. He was managing it. There's a difference. When the session ended 40 minutes later, the applause was polite and thin. Clusters of employees formed immediately, whispering. A few glanced at me, then quickly away. Others offered small nods as they passed. I didn't rush to defend myself. I didn't need to. Instead, I walked calmly to the refreshment table and refilled my glass. Appear steady, and people assume you are. Clara. I turned. It was Martin Hale. Up close, he looked older than he did on stage, silver threading through his hair, lines etched deep around his eyes from years of navigating corporate storms. Walk with me, he said quietly. We stepped out of the ballroom into the quieter corridor lined with tall windows overlooking the city. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the carpet. That was unexpected, he said. Which part? I asked. The public call out. I nodded. I assumed as much. He studied me carefully. You handled yourself well. Thank you. There was a pause, heavy but not hostile. Daniel believes the division has grown complacent, Martin said. Headquarters supports decisive action. Decisive is different from theatrical, I replied. A faint smile tugged at his mouth. You think this is theater? I think public humiliation is rarely about metrics. He didn't argue. Instead, he asked, is there something I should know? There it was. The opening. Not an accusation. An invitation. I could have unloaded everything right there, pulled out the black folder, laid the invoices on the windowsill, explained the consulting contracts that predated Daniel's promotion. But timing matters. Information, like leverage, loses power when used impulsively. I think you should review the consulting expenditures from Q1, I said evenly. Specifically those approved during the leadership transition. His eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. Why? Because they align closely with the revised growth targets Daniel implemented. And because the vendor in question appears to have had prior involvement with him. Martin was silent for several seconds. That's a serious implication. I'm aware. Are you making an accusation? No, I said calmly. I'm suggesting due diligence. He exhaled slowly. Send me what you have. I will. He nodded once, then walked away without another word. Back inside the ballroom, Daniel was surrounded by department heads, his posture restored, his voice animated again. If he was worried, he didn't show it. But when his gaze met mine across the room, something flickered there. Recognition. He knew I hadn't folded. He just didn't know how far I was willing to go. That evening, back in my apartment, I laid the black folder on my dining table and opened it fully for the first time since the summit. Invoices totaling $780,000. Consulting services vaguely described as strategic optimization. Approved within 24 hours of submission. No competitive bids. No performance benchmarks. And most interesting of all, the consulting firm, Stratus Advisory, had been registered under Daniel Mercer's name 3 years earlier before being transferred to a holding company 2 months before his promotion. Technically, everything was legal. Technically. But ethics in corporate leadership aren't measured by technicalities. They're measured by patterns. And the pattern here was clear. Inflate projected growth targets, position yourself as the savior capable of achieving them, and quietly funnel preparatory, consulting, funds through a connected entity. It was elegant. Almost impressive. If it hadn't involved undermining people who had built this division long before he arrived. My laptop pinged. An email from Martin. Subject line. Documentation. No greeting. No sign-off. Just a single word. I attached the files. All of them. Then I added a brief note. These documents reflect consulting expenditures approved between March 3rd and April 28th. I recommend cross-referencing projected ROI with actual deliverables. I hit send. There's a moment after you release information like that. A suspended silence where you realize events are no longer entirely within your control. I felt it then. Not fear. Not regret. Just inevitability. The next morning, the office atmosphere was electric. Word of the summit confrontation had spread overnight. I could feel it in the way conversations paused when I walked past. In the sudden politeness of colleagues who had kept their distance for weeks. At 10:17 a.m., Daniel appeared at my desk. He didn't knock on the partition. Office, he said shortly. I stood without argument. Inside his glass-walled office, he closed the door and lowered the blinds halfway, not fully private, but symbolic. That little performance last night, he began, leaning against his desk, was unnecessary. I responded to your question. You undermined leadership. I clarified data. His jaw tightened. You're treading a dangerous line. Am I? He pushed off the desk and stepped closer. I don't know what you think you're doing, Clara. But if you're planning some kind of insubordination campaign, I'm planning to do my job. Silence. Then he said something revealing. You've been here a long time. Yes, long enough to know how these things usually end. There it was. A warning disguised as wisdom. I held his gaze. Do they usually end with transparency? His expression hardened. Be careful, he said quietly. And in that moment, I understood something critical. He wasn't entirely confident. Confident people don't issue vague threats. They don't need to. As I left his office, my phone vibrated. A calendar invite. From Martin. Subject. Executive review. Urgent. Attendees. Martin Hale. CFO. Internal Audit Director. And Daniel Mercer. Scheduled for 2 p.m. I glanced toward Daniel's office. He was already staring at his screen, unaware of the meeting that had just appeared on my calendar. He didn't know that I had been invited too. He didn't know that the conversation had moved beyond optics. And for the first time since that spotlight found my face, I felt the balance of power shift, not dramatically, not visibly, but decisively. At 1:58 p.m., the executive conference room felt colder than usual. Not physically, strategically. The long walnut table was spotless, screens already lit, water glasses aligned with almost surgical precision. When I stepped inside, the CFO, Elena Ruiz, was reviewing documents on her tablet. The internal audit director, Samuel Price, sat beside her, flipping through a printed binder. Martin stood at the head of the table. Daniel entered 30 seconds later. He stopped when he saw me. "That's a mistake," he said lightly, though his tone lacked conviction. "No," Martin replied. "It isn't." We took our seats. The door closed with a soft, final click. Martin didn't waste time. "We're here to review consulting expenditures and projected growth adjustments made during Q1. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Relaxed posture. Controlled breathing. He was performing again. "Happy to clarify anything," he said. Elena tapped her screen, and the first invoice appeared on the monitor. Stratus Advisory, Strategic Optimization Phase 1-$240,000. "Daniel," she began evenly, "can you outline the deliverables tied to this payment?" "Market restructuring analysis," he replied smoothly. "Preliminary groundwork for the aggressive scaling initiative." Samuel flipped a page. "We've requested documentation of that analysis. We've received a 9-page slide deck." "Yes," Daniel said. "Executive summaries are efficient." "Executive summaries," Samuel repeated, "typically summarize something more extensive." A pause. Daniel smiled faintly. "Not always." I remained silent. Contrast framing works best when you don't interrupt someone unraveling their own narrative. Elena advanced to the next invoice. Phase 2, $310,000. "And this?" "Implementation mapping." Again, Samuel said calmly, 9 pages. Daniel's composure flickered, barely. "Are we questioning strategic direction or nitpicking formatting?" Martin finally spoke. "We're questioning alignment." Daniel's jaw tightened. "With what?" he asked. "With ethical governance," Martin replied. The air shifted. Samuel slid a document across the table. "We also conducted a registry search. Stratus Advisory was previously registered under your name." Silence. Daniel didn't look at the paper. "That's public information," he said. "I founded the firm years ago." "And transferred ownership 2 months before your promotion," Elena added. "Which is perfectly legal." "Legal," Martin said quietly, "is not the same as transparent." There it was again. Contrast. Daniel exhaled slowly, recalibrating. "Are we seriously implying impropriety? Because if so, I'd appreciate direct language." Martin's eyes moved to me briefly, then back to him. "We're implying that aggressive growth targets tied to consulting frameworks associated with your former firm create the appearance of conflict." "Appearance," Daniel repeated. "Yes," Elena said. "And perception impacts shareholder trust." Daniel turned to me then, sharp and deliberate. "Did you initiate this review?" I met his gaze evenly. "I provided documentation when asked." "So you admit you escalated?" I complied with due diligence. His voice hardened. "You're overstepping." Samuel closed his binder. "She's not." That landed heavier than anything else said so far. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. Martin leaned forward. "Daniel, this isn't about ambition. We hired you to challenge stagnation. But leadership requires discretion. And public humiliation doesn't?" I asked softly. The room stilled. Daniel shot me a look, half warning, half disbelief. Martin didn't look away from him. Last night's approach was ill-advised. It was accountability, Daniel insisted. It was spectacle, Elena corrected. Silence again. Daniel's breathing shifted. Slightly faster now. "You're all overreacting," he said. The division needed a shake-up. Clara represents the old guard. Comfortable. Resistant. Resistant to what? I asked calmly. To change. I secured our largest retention contract during a logistics crisis. That was your job. And inflating growth projections to justify consulting fees was yours? The words were measured, not loud, but they landed. Daniel's composure cracked. "That's an accusation." "It's a question," I replied. Martin held up a hand before the exchange could escalate. "Enough." He stood. "For now, Daniel, you're relieved of authority over financial approvals pending further review." Daniel blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Temporary," Martin clarified. "Standard procedure during audits." "This is absurd." "Perhaps," Elena said evenly. but necessary. Daniel looked around the table, searching for an ally. He didn't find one. You're letting her manipulate this, he said finally. Martin's voice dropped an octave. No, we're correcting a lapse in judgment. A long silence followed. Then Daniel stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. If this is how we treat decisive leadership, don't expect innovation, he said coldly. And he walked out. The door shut harder than necessary. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Samuel exhaled. There's more. Martin looked at him. Go on. We've identified 2 additional vendors linked indirectly to Stratus Advisory through shared board members. Alina's eyebrows lifted. Amounts? Combined, just under 1.2 million. The room felt smaller. Martin closed his eyes briefly. When will the preliminary audit report be ready? 72 hours, Samuel said. Martin nodded. Then he looked at me. You understand, he said carefully, that if this escalates publicly, it affects all of us. I understand, I replied. And if it turns out to be procedural rather than intentional? Then transparency will confirm that. He studied me for a long moment. You're not angry, he observed. I was, I said honestly. Last night. And now? Now I'm focused. On what? He didn't ask. But I knew. Reputation. Culture. The unspoken rules that allow talented people to quietly endure disrespect because speaking up feels riskier than staying silent. As I left the conference room, employees glanced up from their desks. The tension was visible now. Whispers carried faster. Rumors multiplied. By 4 p.m., Daniel hadn't returned to the floor. At 4:17, an email went out from Martin. Effective immediately, financial approvals within the regional division will require dual executive authorization pending internal review. No names mentioned, but everyone understood. My phone buzzed moments later. A message from an unknown number. You've made a mistake. No signature. No context. But I didn't need one. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my notebook, the same one I had used months earlier when the first inconsistencies appeared. Documentation isn't paranoia, it's protection. At 6:30 p.m., as most employees filtered out, I gathered my things. The office lights dimmed automatically, casting long reflections across the glass walls. As I reached the elevator, I saw Daniel standing near the windows at the end of the hall. Alone. He didn't turn when I approached. You think this makes you powerful? He asked quietly. I think it makes the company accountable. He laughed once, humorless. You could have come to me. Would you have listened? A beat. That's not the point. It is. He finally faced me. The polish was gone now. What remained was something sharper. Cornered ambition. This won't end the way you expect, he said. Maybe not, I replied. But it will end transparently. The elevator doors opened behind me. As they closed, I caught a final glimpse of him, standing rigid against the skyline, the city lights reflecting off the glass like fractures. For the first time since he took the stage, he wasn't orchestrating the narrative. He was reacting to it. And that changes everything. The preliminary audit report was delivered 48 hours later, not 72. Efficiency, I've learned, accelerates when stakes are high. I wasn't in the room when Samuel presented it to the board, but I didn't need to be. The shift in the building's energy was immediate, like the pressure drop before a storm breaks. Doors that were usually left open were closed. Conversations that normally echoed across the floor were contained behind glass. At 11:12 a.m., Martin asked me to come upstairs. The executive boardroom felt different this time. Not tense. Decided. Daniel was seated at the far end of the table. He didn't look at me when I entered. His suit was immaculate, posture straight, expression composed, but it was the kind of composure that comes from rehearsal, not confidence. Samuel stood beside the screen. We've concluded our initial findings, he began. 3 vendors associated with strategic restructuring were linked through shared directorship to Daniel Mercer's previously owned entity, Stratus Advisory. A slide advanced. Flowcharts. Ownership trails. Timeline overlaps. Elena spoke next. Funds totaling $1.98 million were approved under expedited authority during the leadership transition. Deliverables tied to those expenditures were materially insufficient relative to cost. Materially insufficient. Corporate language for unjustifiable. Daniel's hands were clasped tightly on the table. This is circumstantial, he said evenly. You're conflating prior ownership with current control. Samuel nodded. We anticipated that argument. Financial records indicate advisory payments continued to route through a holding structure that lists you as a silent beneficiary until 14 days before your promotion. Silence. The word beneficiary hung in the air like smoke. Martin's voice was steady. Daniel, did you or did you not retain financial interest in these entities during your initial month as manager? A long pause. Then, carefully, indirectly. Temporarily. During transfer. And did you disclose that to the board? Another pause. No. The stillness that followed wasn't dramatic. It was final. Daniel inhaled slowly. I had every intention of divesting fully. Intention, Elena said quietly, doesn't mitigate non-disclosure. He looked around the table, searching for leverage, for sympathy, for anything that might reframe the narrative. He found none. Finally, Martin spoke the words that shifted everything. Effective immediately, Daniel Mercer is terminated for breach of fiduciary responsibility and failure to disclose material conflict of interest. There was no shouting, no theatrics, just the clean severing of authority. Daniel stood slowly. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked smaller, not physically, but structurally, like a building whose foundation had quietly eroded. This division will regret losing momentum, he said. Martin didn't respond. Daniel's gaze moved to me then. Not angry, not even resentful, disbelieving. You could have stayed quiet, he said. Yes, I replied. He held my eyes for a second longer, then walked out. No slammed doors this time. Just the soft click of closure. The official announcement went out an hour later, brief, clinical, citing ethical violations and governance misalignment. There was no mention of humiliation, no reference to the summit, no acknowledgement of how it started. But internally, everyone knew. Over the next week, something subtle transformed. Meetings felt different. People spoke more carefully, yes, but also more honestly. Managers reviewed projections with context instead of spectacle. Targets were debated, not dictated. Martin called me into his office 3 days after the termination. You understand, he said, leaning back in his chair, that your position here has changed. I assumed as much. You challenged leadership publicly. I responded publicly. A faint smile. Fair. He folded his hands. We need structural repair, cultural recalibration, someone who understands both performance and integrity. I waited. I'd like you to step into the role of interim director of operations while we restructure the division. The title wasn't ceremonial. It came with authority, oversight, responsibility. I don't want it as a reward, I said carefully. It isn't, he replied. It's a necessity. I considered that. Then I'll accept it on one condition. He raised an eyebrow. Which is, no more spectacle leadership. Metrics are discussed with context. Accountability is private first, public only when earned. He nodded without hesitation. Agreed. That afternoon, I walked the floor, not as someone vindicated, but as someone visible in a different way. Some employees congratulated me quietly. Others simply looked relieved. Near the break room, I paused. It was the same place Daniel had first criticized, complacency. The same place whispers had started after the summit. Contrast has a way of revealing truth. Humiliation isolates. Transparency steadies. I didn't relish what happened. There was no triumph in watching someone's ambition implode. But there was clarity. Power built on intimidation is fragile. Power built on competence is durable. 2 weeks later, at our rescheduled quarterly meeting, this time in our own auditorium, not a luxury hotel, I stepped onto the stage. No spotlight theatrics, no dramatic slides, just numbers, context, strategy. 200 employees again, the same faces. I began simply. Last quarter, we missed an aggressive revised target by 4%. A ripple of recognition moved through the room. But we preserved $2.3 million in client revenue during a supply chain crisis, stabilized vendor relations, and maintained 96% forecast accuracy. Heads nodded. This quarter, I continued, we will pursue growth responsibly. Ambition without transparency is risk. Ambition with integrity is strength. No one clapped mid-sentence. They listened. When I finished, the applause wasn't explosive. It was steady, sustained. Afterward, as employees filtered out, one of the junior analysts approached me. I was there that night, she said quietly. At the summit. I know. I thought you were going to cry. I smiled slightly. So did he. She hesitated. How did you stay calm? I considered the question. Because humiliation is a tactic, I said. Not a verdict. She nodded, absorbing that. Later, alone in my office, I opened the same black folder that had started everything. The documents were no longer leverage. They were history. I closed it and placed it in the bottom drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. The real turning point hadn't been the audit. It hadn't been the termination. It had been the moment under that spotlight when I chose context over reaction. When I widened the frame instead of shrinking under it. Daniel had believed authority came from control. He didn't know authority comes from credibility. And credibility survives exposure. As the sun set beyond the glass walls, casting gold across the floor, I realized something unexpected. Being humiliated in front of 200 employees hadn't diminished me. It had revealed the fracture lines in leadership, and given me the opportunity to redraw them. Not louder, not harsher, just clearer. And this time, when I stepped into the light, it wasn't because someone put me there. It was because I belonged there.